You're live.
Okay, ready to start? Right away for telecom and power. You're going to tell us about that.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Maria Royal with Legislative Council.
Okay.
And I made an 11th hour decision to provide a copy of my notes. I thought it might be easier to follow along, and I just emailed a copy. So it's posted. Please excuse typos and everything. I just quickly put it together, but it occurred to me that it might make sense to kind of help you.
We like one page.
Organize, yes. One page. I tried to save. I even made the margins really small to try to put it on one page. But so yes, we're going to be talking about right-of-way fees for state-owned, managed, and controlled rights-of-way. So those uses that are within the jurisdiction of the Agency of Transportation. So there is a controlling statute in Title 19, and that's cited here. This is a law that was originally enacted in 1997. And it basically says that the agency shall require the payment of fair market value for the use or access to the state rights of way. There is also a provision in the original law, I'm going to get to the later amendment momentarily, that allows the agency to lease or license for less than fair market value when the agency determines that the proposed occupancy or use serves a public purpose or is justified by other relevant factors such as prior course of dealing between the parties.
That's in the statute.
That's in the statute currently.
Ask a question.
Yeah, right.
So does the statute demand that the agency articulate if they're not charging why?
So in that original piece, there was not any requirement for a written explanation. However, we're about to get to the next section, which was enacted in 2007, specific to broadband and wireless telecommunications. And yes, there is a.
Who might we, just so I get a clear picture in my head, who might we see in this right of way? Who's in these right of ways?
Utility companies.
Okay, so they don't have their own right of way for the most part, or they can have their own right of way, but.
They can be, or they can pay. There's an annual rental charge. So it could be the utility companies, poles and wires. And then they also pay an annual fee for the access to those utilities for maintenance and upgrades. So that I believe that fee is currently collected, and I will be corrected if I'm wrong. But I don't know how much they're currently paying, electric utilities are paying for just the general rent for the state right of way. So
This is for underground people.
this is for all aerial, above ground or underground, anything in the state right of way. So along the highways.
Okay, nothing more private, just state.
Correct. Anything within the agency's jurisdiction control. There are other provisions, and I actually included them. The last section that I was going to just provide for context, there are other permits and fee requirements under state law, so we'll just reference those just for context, but this is specific to those uses within the Agency of Transportation's jurisdiction. So the state rights of way.
So there's rent and a lease. There's two separate. You said there's a rent and then something else?
Right. So I don't know if they call it a license, but there's the rent, which may also be referred to as a license or a lease. I don't know exactly the terminology, and that's an annual payment, just a rental payment. And then there's an additional permit on top of that for the right to access and maintain their utilities, to go on to the right of way.
Just the permit.
Correct. So construction permits, installation permits, maintenance.
Right.
And
so
that's
no cost. I mean, there might be a fee, but to fill it out, but there's no payment for when they get that permit to use it right away.
For that one, I believe there is, And I think, so if you look down, just jumping ahead to other fees.
Right.
So this is the work permit, the state highway access and work permit.
Right.
So I believe under the fee schedule, it's $100 for utility installations and $500 for annual utility permits. And again, that's for maintenance and repair. That's separate from the rental charge.
And that's annual. They pay those every year, $600 a year.
The 500, I don't know if the utility installations, I'd have to confirm that, or you might be able to confirm that.
Would probably be one time based on a particular project.
Right, and maybe they have to get 1111 to do, if they're doing routine maintenance, they would get another one, pay another
And I think for utilities, they're doing routine maintenance annually, so they probably end up paying annually.
Probably.
So, yeah.
And is this per pole or per project, per mile?
So I don't know the answer to that.
1111 is per
per
project.
And I don't know what's a
Unless they have-
statewide or
unless they have
service territory.
statewide, Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll hear from Mayo too.
I don't, yeah. So then, going back to the state, right-of-way rent in 2007, about 17 years ago, you enacted a new provision that is specific to broadband and wireless communications facilities. And you essentially said that the agency is required to collect reasonable charge or payment for use of the state-owned rights-of-way. That money goes into the transportation fund. And then there's a provision that the agency may waive the charge in whole or in part if the agency and the Department of Public Service determines that the provider offers comparable value to the state to meet the public good. And then goes on to say that the term comparable value, which is comparable to fair market value, presumably, should be construed broadly to further the state's interest in ubiquitous broadband and wireless availability at reasonable cost. So obviously in 2007, this provision was part of what was then Act 79, which created the Vermont Telecommunications Authority. So in the earlier phases of broadband and wireless deployment.
And then we got rid of that.
You did get rid of the DTA. It went dormant, I think, in 2015. And many of its responsibilities and any of its assets went to the Division for Telecommunications and Connectivity, which is in the Department of Public Service.
So the auditor looked at this, and the issue was that there wasn't, the waiving was not done officially between the agency and the Department of Public Service. Is that part of what their finding was, that public service never weighed in? That part of the reason I'm wondering, for those of us in rural areas, we had a brief discussion, but obviously some of your small utilities, and we know that taxing of poles and wires, and this sort of is a variation of that theme, for small utilities that are covering large rural areas, they probably are using a lot more right of way to get, to someone who lives in Norton or Canaan, and you've got small utilities like Barton, you've got Orleans, you've got Hardwick. So if we did leasing and had no provision for some kind of waiver or adjustment, we could actually be impacting our smallest utilities with the smallest tax ratepayer base. That could be because you don't, if you're in a more urban area, you're serving a lot more customers with those poles and wires than you are, when you're out in some of the boondocks of the state. It's not just the Northeast Kingdom. There's some very rural areas all over the state. So it's how you would determine that comparable value, I guess, and waiving, which I gather is not been officially done. Is that part of the issue here?
Yes. So you're right, that the auditor, I think, wrote a memo to actually both the transportation committees explaining that the fee had never been collected, and from the auditor's perspective, there was never any attempt to define what the comparable value was and the benefit to the state. I think there was some work done around 2016 by the agency and the Department of Public Service, but never finalized or approved. But I've linked the auditor's memo, if you want to be able to review that. But I also just wanted to say, with respect to the waiver provision, the waivers are only good for 5 years, but they may be extended up to an additional 5 years. And then this gets to the question that Senator Chittenden asked, that extension of up to 5 years requires that the agency makes affirmative written findings demonstrating that the state has received and will continue to receive value that is comparable to the value to the provider. Or it may revise the terms to make sure that happens. So
you can't have a waiver beyond 10 years then?
Well, I don't know.
Or can you?
I don't know if that's not entirely clear to me. So does that then count as a waiver that then can be extended upon additional findings?
Let me jump in. So to Senator Kitchell's point, I'm not saying that I blindly support us starting to collect fees on this, but would you interpret the language that would allow the transportation agency to have variable rates depending on the nature and circumstances of the right-of-ways, so that it's not like either we charge this for everybody or nothing at all, that there is leeway where they could, or would we need to put in statute some sort of policy to determine if it's a rural area where the comparable value should not affect this stretch, but it should affect these others?
I think you could read it as there being that leeway, but it wouldn't hurt if you wanted to make sure that that was clear and define the parameters,
Is this done by finance? I mean, this legislation?
In 2007,
Yeah.
I didn't do it.
You didn't.
That's all I know. So, yeah.
I'm just wondering the genesis of the legislation and who took the testimony, and I don't know.
2007.
Yeah, so I don't know, because that, at that time, at least in the House, I think Commerce maybe was doing telecom work, and maybe it was finance. I don't know if economic development. Finance tends to do utilities.
I
And,
know.
I can find that out though.
Well, or did we do it? I don't remember.
I wasn't.
I know nobody except Senator Mazza and me, and I'm not even sure. So this whole issue around a disparate impact on, ratepayers and smaller utilities, it isn't necessarily something we think about in transportation as obviously as much as finance. I was just wondering whether I understand it's a public resource and the question becomes one of what should be the public benefit. On the other hand, if we disadvantage the ratepayers, the people that live in rural areas with the higher cost, if we have, if we say, all right, we're going to have 5 million in leases or something, who's going to be bearing that cost?
So this caught my interest for 2 reasons. One, the auditor of the state of Vermont, duly elected, sent a very formal letter saying you got to do this. Something's not happening that should be happening to us, and so that's why it caught my attention. And the second reason, to your point, Senator Kitchell, is I'm not against tossing this over to finance. It's just this feeds the transportation fund, and since this is transportation and these are transportation right-of-ways, we are spending money on mowing, maintaining, and putting in culverts. And so it seems to, if it was private land, if I owned 1,000 acres out in the Northeast Kingdom and somebody put power lines through my land and I had to mow it, had to maintain it, I didn't want to negotiate for something. So it just seems that this is a conversation that we should be having, that the auditor is telling us we should be having. And I'm just looking to inform myself on why we're not charging for this and if we need to change the statute.
Especially with the transportation fund.
Yeah, it is anemic, and I'm not debating that. I just think we have to think about collateral impacts and the extent to which we can accommodate them.
And we have to be mindful about who ultimately pays. And ultimately pays, and as you said, Senator Kitchell, we get into those rural areas.
It's going to be the ratepayers.
Exactly.
That's what we're dealing with here. Because the utilities revenue all comes from ratepayers. So that ultimately is what we need to make sure that we're cognizant of how we
Is this some bill or something, or just,
It just came up because of the lack of funds in the T fund and that this would be a way to get revenue that we're not collecting now. Is
what's the anticipated revenue?
I don't know if anybody has looked at it.
So there's like 400,000 poles in the right of way, and you want to charge $10 a year, there's $8,000, or $4 million, $20 a year.
We have a right away guy here, he probably,
Yeah.
he might have some information when we're.
Yeah, AFT.
That's where those poles and wires are located. And I can tell you they've been, we've had, remember Washington Electric and Orange County, they would have litigation on how they were valued, and it's,
Just one other
complicated.
question, the utility right of way that ANR charges, so they are, your ANR is charging this for use on land.
On state land.
State land, so if they're
forests.
cutting-
Yep.
So we're studying to, this was another thing that I thought was interesting, that we as a state are charging it if they cross our land, except if that land is along the roadways,
That's my understanding.
which seems not to make a lot of sense.
That's-
Unless maybe it's just that the scale was so much greater that there's very little in our land, and if we did it across the roads, it would be a.
Wonder how much they get for revenue.
As far as access, once they're allowed to be in that right of way, I imagine that the people that are paying to be in that right of way, the utilities and putting the pole and infrastructure in there, they probably have rules about who they allow to be on their poles at the same time, even if we have another entity though, that we say, okay, yeah, where you can pay us to be in that right of way. We probably would have to be mindful about how much infrastructure we put in that right of way. And so there must be separate agreements being made with utilities that already have infrastructure in there.
Yes, there's actually under the,
And they're making money probably on those people as well.
so the Public Utility Commission has a rule concerning attachments to poles. So a lot of broadband, whether they're stringing fiber or wireless facilities, they all follow those rules and they pay a fee to the owner, the pole owner.
So they can do their own negotiations. At the end of the day, they might not be paying anything for the right of way usage because they've got infrastructure in there and they negotiated a higher deal and then it's a win-win for somebody who is using the state right of way to put in what they need. And then at the end of the day, that could be a generating source of revenue for them.
is the trend towards more underground than poles? Is that a general trend?
I think that a preference might be for underground because, it's more secure, resilient, but it's also expensive.
Yeah.
So,
I think the thing that really discourages the underground here versus down in the south is just the fact that we have what we call frost. And that raises havoc with, unless they can get down deep enough below the frost grade.
It's pretty expensive though, underground
It is.
facilities.
So I guess
We had Rob Weiss from Mayo.
Okay, yeah, okay. All right, thank you very much.
you're welcome.
I guess I'd love to know what they're currently paying, if anything, we're just collecting it in a different way. It's unclear to me why the trans is choosing to, no.
He's got all the answers.
Clear us up, Rob. We got a lot of questions.
Good morning, everybody. Rob White, Project Delivery Bureau, and as somebody mentioned, I was the right-of-way chief for 12 years prior to this. So, and I think 2007, when that last piece was changed, I probably was the right-of-way chief on year one. So, and it's my understanding that we didn't give any testimony on that change to the legislation. So, I'm not sure where it actually came through and what committee. Just to answer our first quick question, ANR is getting about $117,000 annually, and I think about 70,000+ of that is from Vermont Public Television for 3 leases on their property. So it's a little,
That's not Mansfield.
right, it's a little different scenario than utilities necessarily just crossing the property. So I want to talk about federal law first. Federal law actually talks about allowed uses of the highway right of way, and they do this because they know there's public need out there for long linear uses, and one of them are utilities. So they do allow us to allow utilities within our highway right away for no cost. Other than that, if for federal highway, anything that is not a public utility, generally they require us to charge fair market value, and there is a formal waiver process if it's in the public good. So there's a very strict process there for that. Generally, we allow use of the right of way with 1111 permit. It's a fee base. It used to be free probably 6-7 years ago, but they implemented a fee. It's usually a one-time fee. There are utility companies that actually will get multiple per project permits throughout the year, but they also have an annual permit in case there's, storm damage or something that happens that they need to get out there. So they have a standing annual permit as well. But most of those fees are just one-time fees. There's no ongoing fees for that.
Usually per project, does it scale for how many miles we're talking about? How many poles are involved? What does that fee look like?
It's usually just a standard rate. I'm not sure what the rate is. I think
$100.
I think it depends on the type of project, but I think it starts at maybe $100. And actually, I think those fees are currently all waived. I think they were waived when COVID hit, and I think they are still waived as of today. That group
That's
doesn't.
500 annual utility permits for routine maintenance, emergency, on our sheet.
So that's the annual permit that they would get every year in case.
That's what you're talking about, is that?
Yeah, but there's also,
The $100 one.
if they want to do like a pole replacement project of 50 poles, 100 poles, whatever it is along a line, there's also a per project, 1111 permit that's needed.
That would be the $100.
And a fee, I think that's $100.
Mhm. I only have 2 copies of it.
If I may. So the $500, is that per company? So the company pays $500 and that covers all of the maintenance of all the poles in the right of way?
Yes.
Do you know if other states do it that way as well?
I think it varies. I think some it's completely free, others are charging annual amounts that vary depending on how many lines, how many poles, stuff like that. It's varied across the nation, honestly. So specific to telecommunication, we've done a lot of work on this front. Part of the statute talks about fair market value. We've done a fair market value analysis. We do have rates that have a 4% annual escalator that we have determined, but we have never charged any of those to anyone. And the main reason is, one, it's more complicated than just sending folks a bill. It's about being fair and who gets charged what and how much and what's reasonable, because the statute does sort of transition from fair market value to reasonable. What's reasonable, what's not. And the other main issue that we have is the governor and the legislative body put in place 30 VSA 202C, which is specifically about telecommunications and talks about not limiting the need to get telecommunication into unserved areas and areas that don't have services to the level that they need.
And
So
the poles are used to support those functions.
So we felt like these two statutes were conflicting with each other, and such, we have not been complying with the one that was previously mentioned.
So I just want to make sure I understand that, what you just said. So it's a possibility that we're allowing folks to use the right of way for no charge, but at the end of the day, then they're charging people to use their infrastructure of what they put in our right of way. Is that what you said?
Yeah, the owner of the pole shares the cost.
Well, if they're there for free, why aren't we getting a piece of that?
That's fine.
Well,
Because the question is whether they actually are, the fee that they're charging the other users or attaching to their poles that are owned by some entity, and that may vary, right? Is if they're not, then it gets complicated, because if you start saying, well, we're gonna charge, so the owner of the pole is gonna pass on the charge of the lease, And then, but we don't allow it if it's a CUD, right? So,
Well, aren't the CUDs paying though?
no, under the law, we are giving them preference, and that gets into some of the complexity here. No,
They're not, the CUDs aren't paying to attach to like a power lines pole, because I understood that one of the biggest costs of pushing.
no, they're exempt from the lease fee.
The other piece, right?
They pay the pole attachment
Yeah.
fee with the pole
From
owner.
what I understand is that one of the driving costs to pushing these broadband to the last mile has been the pole wars, and that the fees that are being extracted from them to hang their wires to push it to the last mile. That's what I've heard.
And those fees are specifically to the pole owners, not the state of Vermont.
So I interpret what you just said as the rationale, and I'm curious if this has been written down for a written determination, that what we have not been in compliance with this statute is that you see conflict with our broadband initiatives to expand broadband to every corner of the state. My next question is seeing that Vermont, there are service parts of Vermont that are well served, should we maybe reconsider this and collect fees for the service providers that have currently solid, consistent internet service? I mean, why should we not charge across the entire state if there is good broadband service?
Yeah, and great question, and we've considered that. You know, one of the issues here is it gets complicated fast,
I would think so.
right? When you talk about like, and specifically the statute that we're talking about is about telecommunication broadband. But there's telecommunication wires in our right of way in a lot of places, but it's not just for personal broadband use. I know we were in here earlier in the session and talked about National Grid and their electric project, right? They're gonna have fiber optic and telecommunication because that's how they communicate between the two ends of the terminal. So we start to now have to consider, do we break those out? Are we talking about specific companies? We're back to a question of fairness, like how do we draw the line between fairness? And before we go too deep into that, I also want to say that, you know, I mentioned the National Grid piece. We've drawn sort of this line between public utilities, those utilities that drop power to users along the way within the corridor, and those folks are not getting charged. And then on the other side of that line are things like the National Grid project, where that is a line that's not servicing the people necessarily. It's bringing power from one location to another. And in that situation, it's going from Hydro-Quebec to a transfer station in New Hampshire. So we are going to charge them. So it's not that we don't charge anyone. We try to charge the folks that aren't public utilities and have a public good here, and the ones that do, we try to accommodate them in our right of way.
Do you have a general idea, since you were the right-of-way manager for 12 years, what we spend as a state to maintain our right-of-ways with the mowing and the clearing of the brush and the trees and markings, paint, protections?
I don't off the top of my head, but I'm sure it's significant.
A few million?
The question though, are we doing anything more because of the polls that we wouldn't have to do otherwise? Is there actually additional cost?
Yeah,
that the state is incurring?
The only direct cost that I can think of is that we do have to manage these utilities when we have a project, right? We have a whole section set aside that deals with utility relocations, and we have to manage that because, you know, they do cost us money because we do need to push them around within our right of way so that we can accommodate our infrastructure. And I will say it's getting harder and harder every year because a lot of people want to be in our right of way because they're long linear corridors that can be used and
they're free.
And they're free for the most part. You know, I think, and I mentioned National Grid, but TDI, I've talked about that one for years and years. And originally TDI actually looked at Vermont because they thought it was going to be free as well, but it was not. So, you know, in the past, our utilities kept getting pushed out to the outer edge of our right-of-ways, and our right-of-ways are fairly wide, and we didn't really have to deal with them that much. But now our roadways are expanding, allowing multiple users, you know, more users, and those utilities want to come closer just for the ease of maintenance of their lines as well. And so we are starting to get into a situation where there is a lot more conflict, where there probably wasn't in the past.
That costs the state money, the conflict.
No, that's assuming it costs money because we have to mow around each pole.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say we do a lot of mowing around poles necessarily, but just, if there's a maintenance activity, like, maybe a pipe replacement or, maybe some paving that's done. And even on the project side, whenever we're expanding and doing things, we might have to move poles to add a wider shoulder, ditch lines, drainage, whatever it may be. So we do have to work with them closely to move those lines.
We don't ask some of the end users ever to help with that maintenance as far as, or to take care of that section or, anything that would come to mind for you that would be common. I mean, other than maybe, hey, you're doing this, would you do that for us? But other than that, we are responsible solely for the maintenance of our right of way.
The only exception I would say to that is normally utility lines, especially those that are overhead, they have clearing and trimming rights, and they go, and you've probably seen that. I've seen some around here actually where they're actually doing trimming rights because they usually have like a 15-foot offset from those lines that have to be clear. So they will clear trees and other things. So they are doing some level of maintenance for their lines.
So getting back to the projects, if they have to relocate temporarily because of a project, the cost is on them. Is that
Correct.
so you notify them, but then they have to pick up those costs. They aren't following.
Exactly.
The cost of the agency is just the administrative dealing with that, organizing it between the engineers of the roadway and their poles and when timing and all that.
Correct. And there is statutes that talk about if the utilities are within the highway right of way and they need to relocate, it is on their time. They have to bear all that cost.
Do the utilities do all of the tree branch things? Do we have no equipment that does it, or do we maintain some of the tree branch clearing along our road right of ways?
The only reason we would be clearing trees is because they were hazard trees for the roadway, and there may be, it might be a hazard to them as well, but generally we're clearing trees for the safety of the traveling public.
Not the utility poles.
Not the utility poles.
We are working around the utility poles, and when we do maintain it, we have to work around the poles.
I would say generally, I don't see a lot of that type of work. Normally they're far enough off the right of way or the edge of pavement where we don't deal with that as much. But again, the conflicts are starting to get greater for sure.
Questions, comments?
I guess, what would you have us do with this letter from the auditor saying that we're in non-compliance with statute, and you have identified a conflict with state policies and objectives with this? Nothing, just brush it aside?
I wouldn't say nothing, but I think the statute maybe had good intent, but I don't think it's written very well. I don't think the waiver process is very specific about how that's supposed to be done. And it seems like the waiver process sort of runs out. And I think there always has to be a waiver process in place. So, I just think there's some modernizing of that statute and maybe considering what exactly is the objective of the paying for the use of the right of way.
I'll do one more if I could,
Go right ahead.
So you've seen the same budgetary struggles that we have with the T-Fund, and you know that we are short, looking at 4 or 5 years by tens of millions of dollars. Is there reconsideration of this in the circles of your realm that to maybe reconsider abiding by the other statute that we're in conflict with and collecting fees for this?
Yeah. Every day we're talking about ways that we can bring revenue in to help us get done what we need to get done. We know there's a lot of work on the roads that need to get done out there, and we want to find that money, any way we can. But we also realize there's probably an impact too on potentially the people out there, the ratepayers in this instance, or the traveling public. So we're cautious about that.
And I have played devil's advocate a little bit as far as with some of the questions that I did, but I get right down to where Senator Kitchell went and where I followed up. That would be my biggest concern as well, is that they're probably just trying to find a way. There's no such thing as free money. At the end of the day, somebody pays. That's what happens, and it's usually the person that can afford it the least, and or whatever.
Or the utilities that are Green Mountain Power is pretty well capitalized.
Yeah,
I suspect Barton Electric might not be,
right.
or Lindenville. I'm not, that's the whole thing, and that's maybe where you got into the public good and the waiver and determine, I don't know what the thinking was
Right.
back in 2007. And with that, I guess, statutory requirements, so, I just wonder who did this bill. I guess we could go back and check on it. Maria, do
Yeah,
you
it was
know?
Act 79. Let me see if I can look it up. But again, it was part of it was a huge telecom bill. You created
Yeah.
Vermont Telecommunications.
I know, I think it
Authority.
came out of finance or commerce, and
see it,
Vince
yeah.
was involved in that.
You raised a good point about somebody's gonna pay, and it's about a matter of fairness. And so to me, I'm always, when it comes to assessment, rational assessment. And it seems like if we are spending money on maintaining roadways that they are using to generate revenues, it seems fair to assess, to collect some piece from them. Otherwise, we're gonna go look at DMV fees more, or we gotta steal from the ed fund, we gotta find ways to pay for the
You
service.
can't steal from the ed fund, or you'll get your property tax repealed.
You've got these ways, magic ways.
But again, it does get down to it. I mean, you just when you think you found a path to find some more income, then you have to remember again, okay, but who's paying it? Who's paying it? Who's paying it? And that's where it goes.
If you want to balance the budget, you either gotta find the revenue source or start cutting.
Or spend less.
That's right. Start talking about spending less, let's go dig into the budget.
Questions, comments, further?
Well, I guess it's obviously much more complicated than simply yard charging, which, the auditor's report just simply made reference to you're not doing what the statute requires. You've outlined the complexity and the implications and some of the contradictions that you're dealing with here, relative to the statute language.
I don't know what to do with this next. I just have the next 5 years looking at the shortfalls. If the voters let me come back, I would say this is something we need to keep considering and keep in top of mind as a way to balance those shortfalls.
I'm happy to continue the conversation.
I think we need to put everything, we're gonna have to start looking at EVs. If we're trying to replace, maybe we need to start, registration fees the same as we do for snowmobiles, for e-bikes, et cetera. If they're user fees, that's what we're really talking about here. And so, I don't know what the answer is, but user and of the transportation infrastructure is kind of getting redefined for us in ways that historically haven't been part of our discussion, to be honest.
I don't know what the next action items are on this, but this was a good conversation. Thank you.
I think it bears some thought, and I think it bears some more conversation. I really do. I think at some point in time, we need to maybe as a committee, put some questions out there to get answered. That are, after we chew on this for a little bit, and maybe have it back in and see where it goes.
I put it to the advocates that are either on YouTube or in the room. I'd love to know what utilities are paying and all the different fees that they're paying and how that compares to other states. Because if they're getting taxed in other ways to just justify the not collection of this right-of-way thing, that would be rationale for me to feel better about the auditor's letter. But did you ever say that you did do a written summarization as to why this hasn't been collected as per the statute?
We've responded a couple different ways. I'm not sure there was a formal letter necessarily
Back to
from,
the auditor.
yeah. I believe we responded back, but I'm not sure how formal it was.
Matt,
Matt Godovado, on behalf of the Vermont Communication Union District Association, the CUDs, it's correct that we don't pay the tax. We do pay the utilities for the right to attach our equipment to their poles. So I just wanted,
you do not pay?
No, you came to that conclusion, no, we do pay. We don't pay the tax.
Okay.
We pay the utility. In order to put our equipment on Green Mountain Power or Barton Electric or whatever the poles, there are fees, and those fees.
And are those negotiated individually, or is it a set fee?
Between the CUDs and the utilities.
So if we tax the utilities, they're likely to then transfer that tax onto the CUDs.
I guess the problem that really rubs with me, and again, being respect, trying to stay away from all this free money. The thing that grates me the most, I guess, is that And I hear that. I mean, I hear that that's the problem that we have is that, we have this big pot of money, and it's dwindling, and now we're trying to push this out to the last mile. And we're not gonna get it pushed out to the last mile before we run out of money. We're gonna, and then, I hear these wars about trying to attach these poles. I hear horror stories actually. And, so that bothers me some. And then the other thing that bothers me the most, and I know that there's an end game that probably the poor people pay, but the fact that, there might be people using these, right of ways as a profit center for their own gain. And, at the end of the day, there is a thing called nonprofit, but what's nonprofit? I mean, how much do you spend on your own before and you start doing all these deductions and then, okay, well, we're nonprofit. So, somewhere along the way, there is a gain being made, that probably wouldn't have to get passed down to the ratepayer, but we gotta figure that out.
Oh, I think ultimately it does come to the ratepayer.
Yeah.
I don't know how you can avoid it.
Well,
Well,
maybe they gotta buy 3 less trucks each year.
but the utilities are regulated. I mean, these aren't just, they can't, so you've got telecommunications, broadband is not regulated, but your telephone companies are regulated. So some of the concern around egregious practices actually would put them, into the regulatory purview. Yes, Maria.
I was just gonna say, under that PUC rule, the pole attachment rule, there is a formula that the PUC developed for them to come up with the rent that they're gonna charge. And it includes how much space they use on the pole, what the property taxes are, can be factored into it. So there is, they have to follow that formula.
They can't just set a high fee.
Questions, comments, anything else? Thank you very much.
Thank you, great to see you here, Senator.
Yeah. Okay,
Thank you, everyone.
helpful. The exciting one next is the Vermont speed cameras and work zone. There we go. Who's gonna take us to the lead in that one? You are?
Chairman Josh, why don't you get going? So you can come by and run around 11, because I think it's 5 minutes.
Yeah, I wouldn't think of it.
Morning.
Good morning.
Talk about speed cameras. Work zone study.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let us go.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Josh Schultz. I work at VTrans. I oversee the Operations and Safety Bureau. I report to the Chief Engineer, Jeremy Reed here. Today, and I'll go quick, I know we're running behind. I'm gonna talk about speed safety cameras, specifically the study that was done and submitted in 2022. And that study, just to kind of lay the foundation, focused on speed safety cameras as they would pertain to, I would say, automated speed education, an education effort. There was never at any point in the study where the enforcement side, where fines would be issued, was something that was considered. Having said that, a lot of the study, it's 160 pages, this is the first 50 pages. I know you guys have.
Could you put that into 2 pages for me, please?
Yeah, I'm gonna, and in fact, I got it in a page and a half for you.
I like that.
Yeah, and there's a lot in here. You've got there's a lot in here that is, that does pertain to the enforcement side too. So it's kind of like not throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. There's a lot of good info in here. I read it for like the 3rd time yesterday. And so first off, the study was done because of you folks. We were asked to do it. And basically the big 3 asks was, number 1, what's it going to take to implement some sort of speed safety program? Number 2, you guys asked us to research the data. What's the different protocols, the collection, the images that would have to get taken, pictures of the cars, but also how are we going to store it? How are we going to access it? At what point do we dispose of it, use it? Who can access it? Those kinds of things. And then number 3, you asked us to research the costs. What's the tab gonna be? So there was a group that got together and did the study here, you know, again, it was a couple years ago. AOT was one of them. DPS was at the table. They were a big partner. AGC was a big partner. And also, actually, I think I failed to say this, the study was specifically looking at work zones. So speed safety cameras in work zones. And so AGC was at the table, and there was also others, ADS and regional planning commissions, many other partners were there to help do this. Some key findings. I'm going to jump right to some of the key findings that we discovered. First off, at the time, a couple of years ago, there were like 16 states that were doing it, plus DC. When I say doing it, I mean they were doing speed safety cameras, but they had the enforcement arm going. So they weren't just doing the educational campaigns. As a matter of fact, I'll say this, that as we went about putting the study together and doing the study, we couldn't find any other states that simply just did an educational effort, you know, just sent, you know, sort of, I guess, warnings or educational pamphlets out to folks. That was a part of it, and I'll get to that in the very end here, but nobody just solely did that. All the other states did some sort of enforcement, some sort of fines were issued at some point in the program. We discovered that the mean speed of drivers was reduced by like 4 to 8 miles per hour. But I'll go a step further. The percentage of vehicles that reduced, that were going over 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, that was like, it was like 34 to 94%, 39 to 94% of the vehicles that were no longer did 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. So the numbers are there that the speed safety cameras, they work. So other things that we found out as we did the study, I'm just kind of go through these. I have them bulleted in front of me, so I'm going to kind of just go down the list. And if you guys want to stop me at any point, Matt, and talk, play Stump the Engineer, you can. You'll probably win. So about a third of the work zone crashes that we had in Vermont.
We look at key findings, is that what you're?
I'm looking at right now, and I'm gonna cliff notes it down for you to half a page, and I'm gonna give you some of the recommendations also. So that's what I've got here in front of me. But about a third of the crashes, they in work zones in Vermont, they involve speeding or reckless driving. That's in work zones, and that's higher usually. Like if you look at the overall crashes, you're looking at about a quarter, 23%. Yeah, you got it. So exactly. So the numbers are up for the speeding and reckless driving in work zones. We do have constraints in work zones. I know you probably all you folks know that, but you know, there's, as far as like trying to influence behavior of drivers. So some of the constraints are law enforcement, like personnel, the resource constraint there, but also site constraints. You know, you've got a lot going on and you're trying to get vehicles in a small area so we can get a job done and get a bridge built or a road paved or whatever it is. So, you know, you got space constraints, you're squeezed there, and that can be a challenge for enforcement, traditional enforcement. We also, as we were doing this, we discovered that we definitely saw merit in establishing really solid protocols right at the get-go before like embarking on something like speed safety cameras. We want obviously transparency with the public, but also just the credibility side. And so what I mean by those protocols, I mean, we just want to make sure we know exactly what we're gonna do with the data. We want to be able to answer all those questions. We also want to know exactly like what are the standards so drivers kind of know what to expect. You know, where the sign's going to go, you know, what's this going to look like right from the get-go, rather than kind of go in, you know, and try to learn as we go kind of thing. There was that. A lot of other states did soft warnings initially. So that comes in a couple different flavors. You know, some states would do like the first month they would put these out. They would have like for the first month, they're all warnings and nobody would get issued a fine. Other states, what they would do is they would actually, for per driver, like the first warning or the first infraction would be a warning, and then after that there'd be fines. So, however you kind of look at it, what other states did, sort of like some sort of a warning phase prior to then like the fine implementation of the enforcement side. We did learn that even with, there are turnkey vendors out there that do this work. But even, you know, for Vermont, if Vermont were to hire a turnkey vendor, which we actually do recommend, there's also a lot of work that needs to get done, like administrative work that has to get done from various agencies across state government. So the vendor can do a lot of the work, but there is a pretty good personnel pull, and work that would have to get done. I guess I'll just say the educational focus 22 study, enforcement did have a role in this, even though it was educational. We made sure that they were at the table, and they wanted to be at the table, and so they were a great partner. I think I mentioned that already, but and then finally the key findings is that we found that no matter how you slice it and dice it, some sort of speed safety program would simply it wouldn't replace like sound engineering and traditional enforcement and a lot of the other practices we put out there. The blue lights that you see, you know, we were not looking to take that away. This was simply to add to what we're already doing and putting into practice to enhance safety in work zones. So
this report we had last year.
Yeah.
So we did take action to move forward this pilot based on this report, but then it didn't happen for the reasons that Michelle articulated. So we're revisiting this to possibly consider how that we could get this to move forward.
Yeah.
Because what I heard you say, and I love that testimony, work zone cameras work. This creates better driving behavior, which is what I'm after for increased safety. This, as much as this initial price that is in your report about the $1,500 per shift, I think that's for the pilot. And in my naive perspective, technology can save us resources with less cost per person.
Wouldn't it allow in a work zone extra, like it's 20 miles out work zone 25 or
for the speed, the
Yeah.
threshold,
Yeah.
it varies with states. We would recommend 10 miles an hour is what the report recommended.
Oh,
instead of 30, you're allowed up to 40 before you get a ticket.
Yes,
So if it's 55, you would allow a 10-mile variance?
that's based on working with talking to other states and what other states do. Yeah, it tends to be like 10 to 12 miles an hour. What other states, other jurisdictions across the country typically do, and our recommendation was
It's like
10
on
in
the
the report.
interstate, when you're closing lane, it's 55.
Oftentimes, yeah,
Might be lower sometimes.
it could be lower. Yeah.
And what is the findings? Is there a finding, of, how much it reduces workplace crashes? I mean, I see the speed, I saw the speed finding about what it is, but is there a finding of how much it reduced workplace crashes? I mean, work zone crashes?
Yeah, so I didn't find a finding on that as I reviewed this report. It focused on speeds. Now, I will say, playing out the logic, beginning, I said a third of the crashes were due to speeding and reckless driving. So if you reduce the speeds and the reckless driving, you're gonna reduce the crashes. Just
But you
reducing
wanted to
that.
know the experience in states that had
Yeah.
it, what the outcome was.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess where I'm going with that is that
I haven't got
you
a.
can't put a price on public safety, I get that, you can't put a price on life, I get that. But there comes a time where you have to put a price on it to know whether the money you're gonna spend is gonna drastically reduce and to help. And when you're on budgetary constraint, as we are right now, is it prudent for us to go out and spend $1.1 million per camera and then you start adding cameras? Are we gonna get the results that we're looking for with the money that we spent? And I know that's a slippery slope because if it saves one life, well, then is a life worth $1.1 million? To most people, it probably is. But when you're running a business, are the money that you're going to spend out there to reduce these crashes, is it worth the rate of return that you're going to get?
New York City school zones, 15% decrease in total crashes, 14% decrease in injury crashes, 21% decrease in severe total crashes.
Oh,
Yeah.
so there is some.
Russia, and my goal is that they use federal funds. And it's still taxpayer money either way, but it wouldn't be from
from the T fund. Did we have to match it though?
I assume there's some.
Small match.
Sure.
I'm gonna assume there would be some sort of a state match.
Michelle did mention, federal match, I mean, a grant to.
Right.
Yeah, and
Jeremy
if
can talk about that as well.
Yeah, so Jeremy Reed, Chief Engineer. So what we've been told is with a warning only or an education only campaign, we would not be eligible for federal funds. So the study as proposed would be state funds only.
But if we revise that and allow for
Enforcement.
with not fines is a word we can't use, but citation, tickets,
Yeah,
or pick the term,
assessments.
assessments,
Yep.
then do you feel optimistic that the feds would fund this? Michelle seemed to have been.
Yeah, the feds would help participate. You know, again, the funding splits to be determined, but they would participate in a assessment.
I think we have a long ways to go to determine to whether the public is going to raise privacy concerns, to whether, you know, I'd be very nervous about spending any money until we got that resolved. There's probably court challenges that are gonna happen over that.
That's why I support this pilot as opposed to what's in the other bill we looked at, which does the whole enchilada, allowing municipalities to do it. I feel like this pilot is the cautious intermediary step to work through those kinks and concerns, focus entirely on public safety and work space.
We were gonna hear from the ACLU on that issue, and you're right, we would definitely have to go to that. But I think Mr. Reed has other testimony from the agency's point of view.
Sure. Any further questions?
Yeah.
All right, Ed.
So just to summarize the administration's position at this point, we support the study. At this point, we don't support assessment fine criteria, principally for two reasons. All the details of how that would work. You know, we'd have to get law enforcement on board. We'd have to get the judiciary on board. You know, if somebody appealed or fought the ticket, who would represent the state? Typically, it would be the issuing officer. In this case, it's a third-party vendor. You know, so there's just a lot of details at this point that remain unknown. The second reason is you create this disparity between outcomes within the work zone for those who get a ticket from an officer and those who get a ticket from, you know, the camera. So some of the initial thought would be you'd get an assessment with no points at a fairly low dollar value. Whereas if you get a ticket, you know, it's a pretty hefty fine. The fine's doubled. There's points on your license. So the exact same infraction has very different outcomes depending on sort of quote unquote who catches you. And so for those reasons, we support the study as presented as an initial pilot.
And as you kind of said, it's kind of funny. I raised this the other day. We have these big threatening signs, but yet we're not gonna do that. You know, we're not gonna get there. It's gonna be a lower fine. Of all things, if you can make a justification to why you would have a bigger fine, it would be in a place that you would want to change behavior, slow down, or it's going to cost you.
Right.
But yet we haven't even got to that point yet.
Right, great point. So part of the study did say, you know, there should be additional signs notifying motorists that there is camera enforcement going on. So to Senator Eagle's point, we've, you know, done everything but send them a telegram that there's enforcement ahead. And if they're still an offender, they get a much lower fine than if we just purchase, you know, state police or county sheriff out there.
Chairman Moses. I would just overlay what you just said with some other testimony we had from the Vermont State Police, which is since the pandemic and for other reasons, the number of times that they're pulling people over has dropped precipitously. And I don't know if anybody here wants to change that. I don't know if we want the police officers pulling more people over. So the argument that we just think that there's disparity between the two doesn't seem like a stopping point for me. If anything, it means I think it makes more sense to look at using technology to free up our police officers so that they're not having to pull people over, but we still achieve the ultimate objective objective of better, safer roadways, especially around work zones. So I still think that we should look at adjusting assessments and allowing for this to gain access to those federal funds, because I think it's the right direction to move in. And that was what the other testimony said the other day too, but I forget who it was from law enforcement. He said, this is absolutely the right direction to go in. And that's
I
what
probably had a lot to that about the benefits of having manned people pull people over, but I guess this probably isn't the forum for that, so I'm not gonna get into
And
that.
we did hear, although I don't know if I had talked to, I think it's Captain of the Intelligence Bureau Center.
Captain Long.
Yeah, I think he was in here just in the committee room. He wasn't actually testifying, or he wasn't as excited about it as Lieutenant Sergeant Howard, who thought it made sense from his point of view as a patrol officer. So, and I think the main concern is who issues the ticket, because some other states, an officer is involved. They look at the camera and they say, "Yep, there's the license plate number that I can see in the photo, license that matches up on the computer." They send it, their name is on it, and if the person challenges it, that officer would show up at the court. I thought that there were some states that just do almost like a toll, where the third-party vendor sends it out. And I think I saw somewhere where it's not for all tickets, but for some tickets, they do not allow you to, there's no due process, which is maybe a separate question. But they just say, like, if for a ticket under $25, you can't fight it. But I don't know what happens if you don't pay it. I don't know in those instances.
Canadian tickets, other country, I imagine,
Yeah.
how that works.
Right. Well, and that raises another sort of detail that needs to be worked out, right? If it's an assessment to the vehicle, how do you compel payment, right? And we've talked about either not registering.
Car to pay.
Right,
Does
I
your
mean.
car have a checking account?
That's a secondary result, and those things, I definitely don't want these clogging up the court systems and demanding more on our law enforcement, but if it achieves the objective of better, safer roads, which I certainly think it does, and I heard this testimony otherwise, I still think it's worth pursuing.
Yeah, no, I think so too. We would just have to figure out some of these things. Is there a way to make it? Because I think what law enforcement doesn't want to do is put an officer at desk duty to look at camera pictures all day and write tickets.
The other thing is, we're not blazing a trail here. This is being done. It just makes sense. The technology is there, right?
I just don't like the double standard as far as where the fines are coming and who and what it is. And I guess if we're gonna get down to assessing a fee or issuing a ticket, however you wanna say it, I'd rather have it in the hands of people that do that versus creating a whole nother layer of complexity as far as administrative people doing that.
Because that was a question, can some other administrator do it, not a sworn law officer?
When we were talking about third parties doing this, you were saying yes, and I agree with you to say something.
Well, just some of the vendors, they actually, so typically what you'd have is actually two different reviews. And so the vendor, let's say you have a third party vendor, the vendor would do the first review. And if all the boxes get checked, then it would go to a second review. Some states, they have some enforcement entity that would do that second review. We did find that at least one or some states will actually have that third party vendor provide the second review as well. And that's something that does occur apparently, so.
You don't remember what state?
I don't remember who, and I can say the other challenges I was reading through the study again was that this study the study was done thinking about education. The enforcement wasn't the focus on this. It just happened that we had to talk to a bunch of states that have used the enforcement arm. So we weren't probing in that direction. We weren't probing, okay, we were thinking, as we did the study, our minds were warnings are going out. So we weren't really worried about people contesting and what's the second review look like, who does it? It was like, well, they're going to get educational pamphlets in the mail. So not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There was good stuff in here that I think is absolutely applicable to enforcement, but it was not forefront on our minds as we were doing the study.
I think what would help me to go a long ways is that Senator Chicken said, we're not blazing a new trail here. I'd like to see some states that are doing this and how they got to it, because there's no reason for us to go out and reinvent the wheel if it's already successfully being done elsewhere. And I know we talked about, was it Pennsylvania?
Right here, Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania,
Delaware.
and I'd raised that, New Hampshire with the toll system and all that. I mean, nobody seems to be arguing those and taking those to court, you know. I mean, you go, do I get a ticket in the mail? Oh my God, you know, they're gonna pay it.
Right, and slow down.
Yeah.
Did you say Delaware was gonna testify?
We had tried, Megan has been valiantly trying to connect somebody in Delaware, but we have not yet succeeded, but. Because what Delaware, I don't know how they do enforcement, what Delaware did use the third-party vendor. But they just passed their law in 2023, so I think that they're in the process of setting it up.
And if I could offer, Connecticut just recently implemented this as well. I don't know the details about it, but I do believe it did involve law enforcement as well. So the education piece only would be somewhat novel. But again, each jurisdiction has different enforcement approaches.
And what I heard, just from a little bit that I've been reading on it, that Connecticut is considered a successful implementation, but it depends on how you measure success.
Yeah, my counterpart, from the construction engineer in Connecticut, and these numbers aren't right, but there was something like a 90% reduction before and after implementation in work zone speeding, where they did it. I mean, don't hold me to those numbers, but there is a stark contrast. Yep.
It just work zones, the workers are so vulnerable, just
If
absolutely.
you've never worked in one of those, and I right over here, on this bridge right over here, it is scary, it is scary.
When you were like a teenager?
Yeah.
Where you jump out of the way, jump in.
I worked one summer over here on these bridges, right on the interstate, and doing that, and
That would
drilling, and
argue for a pilot specifically targeting work zone and protection, because those workers are so vulnerable.
And even if it doesn't lower crashes, it improves their work environment and just not being stressed with how fast they go.
School zone, well, that always scared school zone.
Yeah, well, like New York, you've read, does it in schools.
Yeah, because they have somebody hit the other day, I guess. Get across the street, school bus. God, that's frightening.
Well, Capstone's in the hallway, so the Appropriations Committee wanted Transportation to take up that testimony, and
All right.
Appropriations wants to vote the bill out today.
Okay,
Hopefully.
anything else? Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, we get to our next question.
so I took a summer off, I didn't know what I wanted to do, all I wanted to do was work, I just wanted to work, and I did that.
Yeah.
That was in 91,
Before they,
90 or 91.
mowing of the highways was done by hand by size. A lot of them worked.
Today,
Oh, yeah.
I'm great, how are you?
Can you imagine?
Not on the agenda.
No, you're not.
Apparently not what?
The agenda?
Now you are.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the agenda got updated on online.
Thank you.
So I think we did, well, we've heard about mileage Spartan in the past. And so and then I can't remember who gave us the basic information about the governor's proposal to transfer some money from Replace Your Ride to Mileage Smart. The House in the VA changed that amount from $1 million transfer to $500,000 transfer.
And then we just got a letter from Sue Minter, I think supporting the original transfer.
Right.
And that's what we just need, this committee needs to weigh in on the budget adjustment request, specifically not to get into the details of what one program does another. It's really around money in one program being transferred to support the higher demand for the benefit and the Mileage Smart program.
So maybe, and I think the House said, well, I don't think they need the whole million. We can do the other half in the budget or in the T-bill. So if you just, I think it would be helpful to the committee if you just told why why should we go with the governor's recommended $1 million instead of House's 500,000?
Okay,
Which is two-step.
thank you. Paul Zabriskie, Capstone Climate Impact Director, and I'm with Hannah Wilkins, who's the Mileage Smart Program Manager. I think we'll just jump right in.
Yeah.
The House reduced the recommended $1 million transfer by applying a linear look at the past. It took the average of the last 12 months and applied that to the next 6 months.
Oh, but sometimes startup delays and distorts that earlier experience.
Yeah, well, we're now in year 3 and we're on a growth trajectory. This January was our busiest month yet, 53 vehicles delivered. So that linear projection is risky because we're on a pace to go much faster than that. We also recently implemented some changes. We increased the incentive that goes to people who are eligible for 3 squares. So we created a 2-tier incentive to try and meet sort of the climate justice goals of making sure that the most vulnerable households have access to the same resources that all other households have access to. We've also had a situation where the program was intended to do market transformation. And what we're seeing is dealers are now bringing EVs into the state, inventorying cars that are targeted to the Mileage Smart program.
Okay, so the inventory is greater,
Inventory is significantly greater.
which was a constraint on prior experience.
Exactly.
Which would argue then the prior experience is somewhat flawed based on these changes.
Well,
That's your argument?
That's our argument is to take our activity in the last 12 months doesn't really represent where we think it's headed.
Why is it electric vehicles aren't selling it like they thought they were going to sell? Production's way down. They want more hybrids, the consumer, because electric vehicles, they say their manufacturers are cutting way down on half production.
I think that's a national trend. I'm not sure that that's a Vermont trend. It's
Oh,
certainly not a trend that we're seeing because we're seeing more and more people out looking for used EVs. And our program is strictly used cars in Vermont. And you have the percentages on the top of your head, the percentage that are.
Any percentages on new car vehicles, like EVs versus hybrids or sales? Okay.
We can't speak to it.
Okay.
We're,
Yes, we could have him present at some point in the committee and just go through
I'm just curious, I read the other day where the all electric vehicles are not selling.
Can I ask a question just so I can understand it better?
Yeah.
I probably of you, Jane. So in the BAA, this program must be falling short on funds.
No.
And so the governor's proposed $1 million to help.
To move it from replace your ride, which has had a slower take up, to move the money to this program where, based on the most current experience, which seems to be evolving rather quickly, would suggest that the $1 million requested in the governor's is a more appropriate response to the need than the 500,000 that the House did, because they were using a projection that really didn't reflect or adjust for the current experience, more recent experience, that is driving a higher rate of take-up than looking just at the historical the House used. So the argument is they like the governor's recommend. I mean, that's what they're saying, is based on their thinking, the governor's recommend of $1 million seems to be warranted, using that more current experience in the last 6 months.
6 months, but really it's the last 3 months. And
3 months.
the third factor is the federal tax credit for income qualified households for used cars, a $4,000 incentive that can stack on Mileage Smart came into effect in January as well. So we've been working with Patrick Murphy and the team at VTrans. So their recommend was using all this data that we've been sharing.
Do you have a slide that just says those 3 factors that have changed the take-up rate the last 3 months? Is there something on the budget?
It's, you know what, it's in the letter we sent you. It's those.
It's a letter that
Those
Sue
bullet
sent.
points, yes, the letter that Sue sent.
Okay.
And so there's, because if we only did 500,000, you might correct me for the letter, you think that would run out before the fiscal year?
We are concerned that we'd be in somewhere in May, we'd be out of funds, and we're, because we're a market transformation project, putting a pause on this it's just a huge disruption. Dealers can't rely on the fact that it's there.
And both programs are really to achieve the same policy goal. It's not as though we're moving, to build airports or something.
Why do we need to bucket these? Why can't we just say there's this much money for these 2 programs and figure it out?
They have different rules.
I think they were previously bucketed
And is
in BAA.
appropriations letting transportation make this decision, or appropriation must be weighing in on it?
No, we need a recommendation.
Right.
And so we have the BAA that has the 500,000. We now understand how they arrived at that.
Okay.
Your basically your position is the 1 million is what you would recommend based on the very significant change in historical patterns that have been experienced over the last quarter.
Exactly.
Okay. And Senator Perchlik and I are both on appropriations, but as a courtesy, we always have this committee be aware of what's being proposed. And
Do we ever split the difference?
no, I don't want to split the difference. We can just go with the governor's recommend. And in light of the testimony that we're getting, that the reduction of 500,000 and the methodology used really doesn't give a good estimate of what the need is going to be for the remaining quarter of the year. I think that's
Who got the 500,000?
House.
And what was the reason?
The historical experience that they use, that would be fine if you didn't have substantial changes in those 3 factors that you identified that are driving the upward trend, take-up trend in the last 3 months.
I don't want to take away from their presentation, but I just heard what I needed to hear to keep it to $1 million. So that's what I heard, so.
That's what you're advocating for, right?
Yeah. In other words, what the governor requested is more reflective of the actual.
I'm agreeing with the governor, see, Russ?
Well, there is hope. I got your lunch today.
Your children's got your pie.
So that's really what we were doing is, because our goal is to try to get the BAA wrapped up. And we wanted to have an opportunity for this committee to know what was happening within the programs you're spending experience. And so now that we have it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you.
your time.
Yeah.
We hopefully come back and actually spend a little time about the details of the program as we look towards next year's budget.
Yeah.
I didn't copy. Can you make me a copy? You can't. You don't have a copy.
We'll send
Yeah.
this letter.
I have an email, but it's buried in my emails. I have hundreds of emails.
It's right here. We can
Can you
send it
Yeah.
to the
Yeah,
committee.
so that we have it as reference, and approach this afternoon, that's all. I just needed to have something to refer to. Well, I can defer to,
Your vice chair.
yeah, my vice chair.
It'll be on the top of your box.
I don't need anything. I can't get to my inbox. I'm telling you, I need to have it handed to me. It'll be there along with the other 112 emails that have come in since this morning. That's my problem. You'll get buried.
Yes.
So don't rely on that as the mechanism to get the information to me, is what I'm saying.
Thanks for coming on a short notice.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much for
Yeah.
having us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Very much.
Well, that was easy.
I wish I could make $500,000 that quick.
We have a,
Well, it's a lot easier just to move it from one to another as opposed to have to find it.
Oh, I get that.
So that's,
so assuming Thea will be coming down shortly to talk about the DMV miscellaneous bill, but we have a witness, I think.
Okay.
Right.
oh, that's,
Out here.
Thank you all.
thank you.
Have a good day.
Can I get a witness? What's that Dusty Springfield? Remember that song? The old.
Nice color you're wearing today, Jane.
What?
Is it all right to say that? It's a nice color.
Nice color.
Yes, I was gonna just comment on that. I love that. That's a,
I bought it.
I figured your mother or grandmother made
I
that.
bought it in Tarragona, Spain.
Yeah.
We do.
Because I was freezing to
Oh,
death.
yeah, it's causing trouble.
What are you doing here?
I'm gonna say hi, see how you're all doing. Should be working on the budget.
We just finished the BAA.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
good.
here.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Our goal is maybe today.
Thanks for the visit.
Yes.
Thank you.
So Chair, just to orient
Yeah.
what this testimony was scheduled for. This is, you remember last year in, I think it was in the miscellaneous bill, we took some testimony about motorcycle mufflers and a federal stamp. We sent it over the House. The House, got in more into it and took it out. But we were taught, and part of the reason was that it's in the inspection manual. The change inspection manual is a big thing. So since we were maybe talking about looking at the inspection manual, we just wanted to orient ourselves with this issue about the federal requirement of having a muffler stamp. And we had never heard from a motorcycle shop. Since we have a motorcycle shop nearby, we invited them to come in and talk to us and maybe even show us a muffler. It's good.
And we'd also talked about, because we made a change for snowmobile mufflers and the stamp. So would try to do something comparable as it would relate to the motorcycles. So, anyway, it's in a holding pattern. Maybe you can help us get it unstuck.
Right.
So just introduce yourself for the record.
Sure. John Lyon, co-owner, Wilkins Harley Davidson in Barre, Vermont. I've been there managing and owning the business for close to 20 years. Was a practicing attorney before that and left to run the family business. And
That's the only motorcycle place in Vermont these days, is there?
there's quite a few there's quite a few different dealerships, but it's the only Harley Davidson
There's
dealership.
nothing in Burlington area.
No,
right?
sir.
It's the only Harley Davidson dealership in all state.
Yes.
They used to be one of Essex.
You said there was one in Essex.
Yeah. When they left there, came here, they closed or went out. or-
Yes, it was a challenged dealership, and the motor company partnered with us, and we acquired it, and
Okay.
thought we
I
might.
thought that, I remember. It was,
Yes, yes,
So
sir.
you're exclusively
Yes, sir.
Harleys.
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
And you saw the language?
I did.
Okay, so
Oh, and as a well, maybe you're not a practicing attorney anymore.
No
but
longer
obviously you have-
practicing. Yes, I
but, you know,
offer
you're-
no
yeah.
advice on that.
That's probably good, but did you like it?
Well, I guess if you're asking an opinion question, my question would be, what would be the purpose? What is the overall purpose for that? What was the reason for creating that?
suggesting the language. The concern came from folks just concerned about vehicle noise, motorcycles and vehicles.
Mhm.
And then testimony we had last year was like, there is this requirement that the federal government has that you have to stamp. So a possible easier way to address really loud motorcycles would just say during inspection, do they have the stamp that's required by the feds?
Mhm.
That's where it came from.
Understood.
And the noise level that some of these, I'm not necessarily saying Harley, but that people can
Mhm.
install are just, they're painful to
Of
hear.
course.
And so that's where we're getting complaints about,
Mhm.
why is this allowed?
Sure. Well, so if the basis for the language was concern over noise, sound, then I would if you're asking my opinion, I'm not sure that this language achieves the purpose of resolving or reducing sound. It's been my experience, a couple things, and I brought an exhaust just to show you a couple things, but it's been my experience in that the revisions to the inspection manual have done more than maybe we're giving it credit for. And so if you were to look at an exhaust, really any exhaust that comes on a motorcycle, or this is an exhaust that we would buy to enhance performance or enhance sound. If you look at the end, and when I pass this around, there are rivets at the end of this, and these rivets allow you to remove the baffle. The state inspection manual does a wonderful job of restricting that ability to do that. So when a motorcycle comes into our facility, we can tell, just by, what's that, sir?
You do inspections.
We do inspections as well. And we do, in the busy months, we're doing 60, 70 a month. And so motorcycles will come in and you can tell really quickly if a motorcycle's baffle has been removed. But so it doesn't pass inspection. There's no photograph. We're just following the guidance. We don't take a picture. We don't upload anything that tells that, but we might say why it's failed. Doing that, following that inspection is probably educating law enforcement, making sure that they're aware of what a baffle looks like. And I think when I show you this, when we pass this around, you'll see what a baffle, if it were removed, what it would look like. This would be empty. So that really, does a bit more in my estimation than adding language to a statute that says we're going to follow the Code of Federal Regulations requirements, and we're going to question how we measure sound and all these other things. But then the state inspection manual does a really, really good job of that. And in my 20 years, I would suggest that it's reduced considerably. When I first started, we would have motorcycles that would come in and we were really focused on tires and brakes, and we really were not focused on the sound of the motorcycle. And now with the new inspection manual, it's done a good job in reducing that.
So what's this bill do?
The language would require the inspection station to fail if they don't see the federal stamp on the exhaust.
Is there a federal stamp on that?
There is a federal stamp, and what I would show you is, so maybe I could just walk this around if you don't mind, and I'll show you. So that would be the name of the exhaust, right? SE, but the federal stamp.
It's underneath here.
Maybe to
A glimpse.
I know, there it is, okay. So this federal stamp is, if we just were challenged finding it ourselves, is a laser etched into a piece of chrome. Where this motorcycle, where that would be the undercarriage of the bike.
So you
And
couldn't see it.
this is about 3 to 4 inches from the ground.
You have to get down on your,
Which is fine for us as an inspection station. But if you're asking law enforcement to do this, we just had trouble with, natural light with it right in front of our face. I'm a little concerned about being able to spot that stamp and then the challenges that carry with that.
so when you install it, is it even visible, or is the stamping where it's lasered on, actually, would it be visible other than getting on your knees? It's not blocked, it's not against the.
On this exhaust, and I grabbed this one because this is the largest exhaust that we sell.
Yeah.
So it's the most visible. Most exhausts are half the size, so they're gonna be a smaller.
But the labeling isn't against the
Allen ones.
structure of the bike itself then?
It's not as visible,
Okay.
that's correct. It would be direct, toward the ground.
Toward the
Yes, I understand
ground, oh my gosh.
If I recall, one of the reasons why we were interested in the stamp, and just because something you said near the end of what you were, before you stood up to with the device, is that my understanding is this language would not require us to start measuring sound. If anything, this is to require the stamp so that it's been assured that this muffler meets that 80 decibel thing, so that we wouldn't get into the,
But-
everybody needs a device to measure sound.
But your testimony suggests that doesn't work because you can have that there and remove the baffles.
My testimony is that the current state of where we are heading is doing as designed. It's slowly, it's just not, if I buy this exhaust and it's got the stamp, according to that regulation, we're in really good shape until we remove this. And now the question is, we're using the inspection manual. So my point is, my question to you at the beginning was, what was the purpose? And the purpose is to reduce sound. So we should be educating and just keeping this baffle in the exhaust, not focusing on the language necessarily what's on the.
So we could declare a victory. We've already done this through the inspection process.
I think the goal would be to do both. Like, we wouldn't take away the manual's discussion about removing a baffle. So I think the question was, what do we do about somebody that takes their exhaust off and puts an aftermarket one that might have a baffler that just makes it louder?
Mm-hmm.
That was the concern. Like,
Sure.
is there something we could do about that?
I would suggest that over time that the current inspection manual is doing a good job of allowing us, both inspection stations and law enforcement, to crack down on those types of exhausts, because the loud exhausts that you're concerned, that I'm also concerned with, because that impacts the industry negatively, is the removal of this. So in many states, I know, and I'm not sure, I don't speak for law enforcement, but in many states, it's, if you're pulled over for a loud, the first thing the law enforcement officer would do would be to look and see if there's a baffle in that. And that's a more visible, obvious modification.
So we're ultra focused on the stamp. What's the stamp mean? So what's it mean?
Says it in the bill. It says meets the 80 decibel standard at 50 feet as set out with 40. The stamp means it met that standard.
Unless it's been modified, the baffle's removed, and that's
the issue.
That's what you're raising.
And I believe that that's what you're after. To solve the issue, you're really after the modification, which is already on the books. It's just, and it progressively is taking time to fix that, issues.
Can you have a muffler or exhaust that has the baffle but is super loud? That you would pass inspection because you say, like, well, they didn't change the baffle, but it's just an aftermarket muffler, because some people really like it.
People would have the stamp too? I mean, that's
No,
what I'm
without
trying
a
to get
stamp.
at.
Because they got it aftermarket, it doesn't meet the decibel sounds, so they could pass inspection. They didn't do any changes to it, they just bought it and put it on there. You would pass it for inspection. This is my understanding.
Yes, if it had a baffle, it would pass under the state inspection in our facility, yes.
And can you have a baffle and be way over that noise?
If the baffle, you're asking, could you have a baffle and it still be extremely loud? If it was modified, which the state inspection manual, I think number 5 on page 59 covers that as well, modifying the exhaust.
It does not allow that. Can't you just
Does not allow that.
Can't you just buy a loud?
I'm not aware of a exhaust that is, you might be able to find, to answer your question, you might be able to find an exhaust out there in the marketplace that has a baffle that could produce a louder sound. Not in our facility, but I mean, I'm sure that anything can be modified where you could find a baffle that has been tweaked of some sort.
And do you see if this was to happen, do you see a negative impact on motorcycle shops that are doing inspections? Like, would it be too difficult, or what bad things do you think would happen?
Well, I don't believe that if you pass this, that it's going to impact us either positively nor negatively. I would suggest, I would ask that we not modify the state inspection manual. It's gone through a wonderful iteration that we were part of, that allowed it to be simplified. That now we're able to talk to customers in a more educational manner versus, you know, a 300-page manual where you've got to really spend, and it's very clear, it's very concise. So it does a good job in that.
And I would agree. I just wondering if there's because it's when we talked about other things, it got really complicated and difficult. So this seemed like maybe an easy thing to do that would help. And maybe it's a very small number of cases that might help some motorcycles be off the road that are just exceedingly loud, but are still passing inspections. Law enforcement could still hold on. We don't have, I guess if it's a municipal law, we heard municipalities could pass ordinances and that those police officers could pull them over and make an issue, but then they have to prove that it was that loud. Which,
Like, so this is your language from motor
No.
vehicle?
this was the language that we passed last year, that the House took out.
I see.
So we're revisiting.
We were just revisiting, we had,
So part of the rationale, I think, to revisit, if I may, is if we are considering rotor rust and if we are considering sun tinting, then that would open up the reconsideration of the inspection manual. And it makes more sense if you're looking at 3 things rather than just 1 thing because of the work related to rules. Is that correct?
that was part of it as well, yeah. And can it be done without damaging the good work that was done in 2017 when it was revised?
And do you know why the House took it out, the language?
I don't remember, maybe Mike and or Thea.
Thea's got her hand up.
The testimony that House Transportation received based on the study on noise, they said, don't make this change until the study is finished, and they were persuaded.
Right, the study is
the noise.
next year.
Right.
Better be a good study.
Yes,
So I live in a relatively well-populated district or more densely populated district, and I get these complaints. I served on the city council for South Burlington for some time, and these are the valid concerns when people live close to each other with motorcycles making way too much noise and it's obnoxious late in the evening. Do you have any advice for us as we want to address that problem systemically through statute or this, if it's not this stamp, is there anything you think we could or should be doing in order to address excessive motorcycle noise?
My advice would be to make sure that ordinances are followed. I mean, if municipal ordinances are certainly, my question would be back, it would be how many ordinances how many tickets or how many violations of ordinances were carried out. We create these situations but not carry through with them. And I think that would be something just purely as I said, it doesn't impact me positively or negatively in my estimation, but if you're to add this, I don't see it effectuating what you're trying to solve.
Where we want to
That's
be.
right.
Ultimately, it gets down to law enforcement or whatever, following what laws are already on the books and trying to do it, other than us trying to legislate something that probably isn't gonna make a difference.
Well, the other thing too is, I don't remember testimony in terms of what is required as part of the inspection process.
Right.
Yeah.
Which does make a difference. In other words, there is a mechanism at the time cycles inspected and you can fail. What they do in between, I guess.
Right, they could always take it off and put the baffle back in for inspection and then take it out.
That's becoming more and more challenging as well. I would suggest that the motorcycle industry, this is a problem for them as well, which is why these are rivets. You know, these are not easily added back in. So once they're removed, you're impacting the integrity of the pipe. You know, so it used to be where these would be screws.
Almost inviting you.
So that's why over time we have less motorcycles coming in that are loud. We no longer,
It's not even the Harleys that I hear they're the smaller bikes, yeah.
Yeah.
Harleys sound good.
I was just gonna comment
That
on,
rumble, you like that Harley rumble?
in terms of the in-between inspections, the language that you'll see in your draft on lines 14 to 16, that's not underlined, so existing statute. A motor vehicle operated on any highway shall be in good mechanical condition and shall be properly equipped. I think there is an argument in case law that removing the baffle would yield a motor vehicle that is not properly equipped and could be a ticket for that if it was sort of someone who was trying to like skirt the inspection process where it's properly equipped for the inspection, but for the other 360.
So that would be a law enforcement.
Yeah, as opposed to.
Right, yeah, I remember talking about that.
Mr. Lyons, it sounds like the motorcycle industry is pretty aware of this and trying to keep this from being an issue as
Seems like
much
you're
as.
engineering it how to be based on.
Yes, sir. And this pipe was manufactured by Harley Davidson itself, and they're more than aware. They've brought this up in multiple meetings, dealer-wide, global meetings, that this is an issue for them, and which one reason why I believe that they're riveting versus doing, a different. So it is serving the purpose.
And why we have you here, do you also sell I forget, is it the live wire, the electric?
We currently service the live wire. We're no longer retailing the live wire. It's a separate division of Harley Davidson.
Okay.
What's that? What's like
Electric, that's the electric,
motor.
that DMV had purchased.
Oh,
Okay. So you're servicing whatever few that might be around, but, so it's, because it's not branded Harley, it's branded live
It
wire.
was spun off of Harley Davidson to sort of live on its own.
Okay. So you sell very many of them when you were selling?
No, the infrastructure is really kind of the challenge for that.
The charging industry.
The charging
Yeah.
infrastructure. Yes, sir.
Did you have to buy a separate franchise then?
We did not have to buy a separate franchise. It just, we were all automatically part of that if we wanted
But
to.
having been in that business, not in the motorcycle business, but the auto business, and dealing with those specialty products, the cost to sell those, to upfit your shops and the equipment and all that was, you'd have to sell a lot of product to ever break even. And
Yes, sir.
I can see why you wouldn't want to do that.
That and the charging infrastructure that we installed, we did actually install all of the required infrastructure, which was about $30,000 charging, fast charging system. It lasted 3 years. And the people that came out from ChargePoint told us that's about the length of time that a fast charger lives, is about 3 years.
wow.
I had charged my car at a Harley Davidson franchise in other states. Sometimes they're the only ones that have.
You can charge a vehicle
It's a
then,
similar.
and the motorcycles can use the same
Yes,
fast charge?
yes, ma'am.
I'll have to take down my Model T.
Thank you. I don't have any other
Any
questions.
questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thanks for
much.
coming down.
Thank you for inviting me.
Anything else? Anybody else with a comment?
Well, we passed the D&D bill last week. Today, we recommitted it to committee, just so we could meet the Senate rules. So we closed out all the sections except the possibility of adding 3 things. And that is window tinting, so I don't know how much you heard about that testimony, and then rusted rotors, and then muffler stands. Do we want to add any of those 3 to the bill, which are all about whether you pass or not pass inspection?
You pull those out, there are none other that relate to inspection, right?
No, there wasn't. If you pull those out, I think we're entirely with DMV's recommended language. We didn't add, or didn't.
If you pull those out, you have the counterfeit airbags and the car seat language that you had rolled in, and you also had made.
But that didn't relate to inspections.
Correct, but deviations from what the
Oh.
DMV had proposed. And then also the work that you had done on the signal lamps, and the prohibiting the blue ones. I've started, the strike all amendment that you would have, for when you report the bill out. And in that, I modified the signal lamp language slightly. One is to just tighten the prohibition on the flashing lights that are a color of anything other than amber. And then also when we were working very feverishly on Friday to get the bill voted out to introduce, you had raised the possibility of not having marked government-owned emergency services vehicles need to go through the permitting process to get signal lamps and sirens. So I worked with the DMV to modify that language further. So you would be having the DMV's recommendation that government-owned law enforcement vehicles don't need to get the permit, this would be also having the same treatment for government-owned emergency services vehicles. The constable-owned vehicles would still go through the permitting process, and like the private ambulance services, for example.
And what was that email from Sergeant Howard? Did he have some about the blue
That
line?
was for the flash and light piece, and now, when you see the strike all amendment, there's an additional piece where it was sort of prohibiting the blue light of any kind unless permitted, the emergency service lamps of any kind unless permitted, and then prohibiting flashing lights of any kind in a color other than amber. So that would be very obviously saying, you can't have a green flashing light, you can't have a purple flashing light. And I think that what Sergeant Howard raised was, like a potential sort of ambiguity in the definition of emergency service lamp, and I think it has yielded better language with him raising that. And he's not excited.
So I'll say, I like this as a bundle, because I am sensitive to creating work, and for just one of these things to go reopen the whole process seems to be more of a challenge, so I was more supportive of revisiting this when the tinting came up, and then when the motorcycle things, and then through testimony, the sound study. The other thing I'd say is, it's been 6 years since we last did this, and it was 5 years prior to that, and I just think the language could be better based on the very valid arguments I hear from constituents that they're getting their rotors failed because the inspection station interprets the surface rust as being a reason to fail. Whether or not the inspection station is doing it right or wrong, I just see an opportunity for improved language. So that's why I keep coming back to this, because I have these conversations with constituents.
But the question becomes one, can you deal with that administratively? If in fact that is a safety issue, didn't we talk about that? I mean, that's an option. So when somebody's got a year-old vehicle and they're getting a failed inspection, yeah. So
My concern is that the language interpreted by the inspection stations is what they keep going to. So administratively, it would be to adjust the inspections language to be more consistent with other
either that or
states.
do an interpretive memo that says
Exactly.
how that rule should be applied, which is what
Exactly.
we used to do all the time in social welfare. So I don't know, that's why I'm asking if that would be another way of skinning the cat.
I think it needs to go around to saying to these inspection stations, listen, I'm telling you right now, there's some bad things coming down the road if you guys don't get this straight. And because as right now, there's a lot of consumer complaints out there about brake rotors. And you guys, we understand that we've allowed you to make this as a profit center for you, but you better be doing this right.
When properly adopted, a rule in the periodic inspection manual is an adopted rule. It has the full force and effect of law. The administrative bulletin that is just issued on its own doesn't have the full force and effect of law. So you're sort of creating this periodic inspection manual light almost iteration. My understanding of some of the past changes that have been done to the periodic inspection manual through an administrative bulletin was in response to the session law from the General Assembly. So I think you could create a situation where General Assembly session law, full force and effect of law, is saying we deem this to be sort of the criteria and this is a safety concern. DMV could do it with an administrative bulletin to buy time on the rulemaking process. But I think just sort of saying here in this room, fix it through an administrative bulletin could yield ambiguity in terms of if the DMV actually understands what you're saying correctly. And then the fact that it's not in the periodic inspection manual because they can't unilaterally change the periodic inspection manual without going through the rulemaking process.
I understand all that. The fundamental question for me is the rule that what's in the inspection manual. Can it be subject to interpretation and that's what we're having the issue? Or do we actually have to go back and modify it? Sometimes it's clarification around the application of that particular requirement.
For the tint, I would say not.
No, not for tint.
So you're just talking about brake rotors?
Yeah, I'm talking about the rust.
Right.
So we talked about this in the last session and you brought this up, Senator, that some of the language that you have written, this does not include surface rust, and being more specific is exactly true. And like you said, where I placed note in the manual, could that be in the beginning and part of the definition? That's not changing rule, that's just clarifying.
Right.
And we do bulletins for that, for other categories and other things. pretty regular basis, at least since I've been there. I could probably write a clarified bulletin with that same type of language.
It doesn't create any conflict
It
with
doesn't
intent
create any
somewhere else.
conflict with the rule. The rule remains the same, because we know exactly what it means. And I would say if I polled 95% of our 3,200 inspection mechanics, they get it. They know what it means. But to capture that 5% or whatever that may be that's bringing us all here today, if I can clarify that in the bulletin, that might help.
You know, or Captain Davidson, could they change the inspection manual by moving just like the definition of rust up? That's not a legal change. Like, so you can't move a sentence from one paragraph to another. Or take 2 bullet points and change them around.
The APA says that the text of the final proposed rule needs to match what is adopted unless it's changed by, like, approved by LCAR. And like, no, you can't move things around. I think they would love if they could move things around without going through the rulemaking process. And I think it would be like opening a can of worms in terms of other adopting agencies trying to.
Yes.
I don't want to dig my heels into this. What I'll say is I can't defend the current language when I talk to constituents, and I think it could be better. I remember in testimony, somebody said something about, well, what about a separate bill without touching the inspection manual, all those rules? If we could mandate that the complaint line, who to contact is not your state senator, but instead Corporal David, or Captain Davidson, or on the inspection sheet.
Maybe a picture of Captain
or in the station so that they know who to.
302-673.
I'm open to that.
Since the inspection manual has changed, I've been the point of contact for every complaint that has anything to do with cars since I've taken this job, so I already do that. So I'm well aware, and I certainly don't mind that. And we post all the regions for all the inspection mechanics by location with their phone number, with their email address right on our website. So you can reach your regional inspector just by going to our website, clicking on a map, and it'll tell you exactly where you live or where the inspection station is, who your assigned inspector is, their phone number, their everything, if you want clarification. And
on the inspection failure form, I'd like it to say this is who you contact if you have an objection.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly.
So I'm back to, we got the complaints, and it's hard for us to understand a year-old vehicle not failing.
6 months.
Or 6 months. Is that due to how the manual is being interpreted and applied? As opposed to, is it, which might not be a safety risk, it's how it's so, and we really tried to focus on safety. So I'm having a hard time with what Anthea is saying, which I understand what the APA is, but so are we trying to clarify the application of what the rule is, not change it in any way?
No, I don't want to change it at all.
And so that's why I'm wondering, should we be failing these 6-month-old vehicles? And most people would say, boy, that doesn't sound very reasonable. How can that be a safety defect that early in the, in the life cycle of the vehicle? So I'm really struggling on what the problem is and whether it's inappropriate or not fully, or need for clarification by the inspector, versus a safety issue.
Or if you carry that a little further, why wouldn't it be a warranty issue instead of a failure where it's a customer pay? Because I don't know what the warranty is now, but it used to be that brakes were 12 no matter what. 12 months, 12,000 miles. And so within that time period, why isn't it going to warranty versus? I think, again, and I've said it loudly, and I apologize to everybody, I think this is as much as education back to the dealer, as far as what constitutes failure and what not, and that we better be taking we better be more careful with how we are interpreting.
And my question is, I don't know if that it's an interpretation or it's a real problem. That's what I'm really struggling with.
Just really quick to that point, Bob Church's testimony and all my interactions, what I believe the issue is the language of the inspection manual being interpreted incorrectly by inspectors. And I feel like that's why we could correct that language, and that's why I think we're here. But that's just my opinion.
Well, if that in fact is the case, we can do an administrative clarification.
Well, that check out.
And you could do that immediately.
But that's only if they read the like, so if in 6 months there's a different person working at the inspection station and they didn't get that memo, then they look at the manual, they could have the same.
Well, obviously, we post it online. I mean, I'll have it posted on our website. All our bulletins go up on the website.
They're not looking at the website.
You're looking at the inspection manual.
Yeah, so I could write language as clear as can be, crystal clear. But if they don't pick it up and read the manual, it doesn't make any difference. Or if they're interpreting something fraudulent, they're not gonna read the manual or adhere by the rules anyway.
They need to
So
call your inspector.
it's still kind of, I don't know, just kind of irrelevant, but I want to answer your question, because you asked a very good question, and it's probably the most common question. How can my car with 10,000 miles, I just replaced the brakes, be rusted? How can my car that's only 1 year old be rusted? Has nothing to do with miles or age. It's use, plain and simple. So if you never wash your car and drive it through a car wash and rinse salt off the rotors, the salt's gonna eat the rotors, right? If you're like my parents and you snowbird to Florida and you don't park your car in the garage, you park it in the driveway, and after 6 months of that car sitting in the garage, snow melting, coming, going, raining, Vermont weather, and those things are sitting there in the elements, it's gonna rust. The example I gave you with use was when I left my house the other day. I showed you that picture of that rusted rotor. That was on my Ford F-150, right? Perfectly good rotor, bright orange, completely rusted, because it sat for a week because I had cold, right? And I didn't drive it anywhere. But by the time it got here, just from basic use, the brake pads rubbed all that rust off. So that rust didn't settle in. Rust is it's an infection. It's a disease. It eats. But if you run a car and that brake rotor is constantly taking that surface rust off, it doesn't eat at the rotor. If you constantly wash the salt off, the rust and the salt isn't sitting there eating. But if you leave a car in a driveway or you leave it outside for a few weeks or a month or 6 months, it doesn't make a difference whether it's a brand new car or whether it's got 10,000 miles or 100,000 miles. It's gonna rust just like anything else.
At that point, it's a safety issue.
Yeah, so once it rusts, and then that rust becomes swollen.
It has to be pitted or swollen or delaminated.
Yes, exactly. So picture the shiny rotor in a pad hitting, and it causes friction, right? And that friction is what causes that vehicle to stop. But if you put a loose material that's rusted, that's elevated, so now you have an uneven surface that the pad's now hitting the rotor, you're taking away the effectiveness of that braking system entirely, right? But if it's surface rust and you run it, that rust just comes right off. But if it's,
I'm just hoping that that's what happens with these inspection stations, and I think that's what, is getting inferred here, that the situation that you're explaining, where it shouldn't be in violation, there shouldn't be any cost, it just wears off. I'm just hoping that that's how it's getting interpreted in the shops.
yes, and like I said, the previous definition used to just say rough. In 2013, the old manual just said rust on rotors. So technically, that first set of rotors I showed you would have been a failure. Now, when they wrote that manual in 2013, they weren't factoring in the orange rust. That they were factoring in rust as what I'm describing, but it wasn't described. That's why we brought that clarification. To go back to Bob Church's testimony, I completely agree with what he says, and he used Pennsylvania, and he used, I think, Maine, or somebody else has used Maine before. But they're saying that you're leaving it up to the mechanic now to decide if the amount of rust on that rotor is affecting the brake's effectiveness. I don't know too many mechanics that could do that, right? And then that's really ambiguous.
Well, I think that what they do is they would basically go back to your point. That's what's in the manual. Is it swollen? Is it delaminating? Is it loose? And I guess people have a hard time believing that it got to that level in such short a time, and maybe it's possible. I don't know.
But right now, inspection stations are failing these things, saying, well, this is the state, I think the brakes are fine,
That's
fine.
That's the testimony where they blame the state, and they say.
They are at 25 miles an hour. So if I do the road test and I stop a car at 25 miles an hour, it's gonna stop. But if I'm on the interstate with 20–40% of accumulated rust, and that friction point isn't there between the pad and the rotor because it isn't operating as designed.
That's what the inspector should say.
It's not gonna stop in a panic situation.
Give them that judgment.
But what they're saying is, what testimony or what constituents have said is that the inspection person said, I think it's fine. But the inspection manual says, look, 3 inches of rust, look at all this rust, they, walk them around with the camera and say, so we have to redo the rotors and it's gonna be $800.
So this language would allow them to say, it's not a safety issue, I see a surface rust, it passes.
Or just have that language about what is rust, right next to the word rust, so there's no question.
Yeah, swelling, delaminated, or pitted as the
Yeah.
manual. Yeah, but I can qualify that in a moment. They say this does not include surface rust that can be wiped off with brake pads. They could also refinish pads, or not refinish pads, but refinish rotors. The drawback is the thickness of rotors aren't what they were 20 years ago, so there's less room to refinish a rotor so it meets minimum thickness standards of the rotor. And that's
So church, some of them you can't even machine, you just have to buy new rotors.
it's tougher now because the rotors don't have the same manufactured thickness as before.
They're
And then
doing that deliberately,
it's-
just like appliances don't last.
Yeah.
I'd love to think that language, education, and all of that is going to keep us from having to deal with this again next year. I'd love to think that that was gonna happen. But I don't know if that's where we're at.
Well, we didn't succeed in meeting all of our goals for the day. Yeah, we're gonna go through all these, but this, we'll have to have Anthea back.
So you can have me back and I can talk about the revised signal lamp language and the revised tinting language, or are you scrapping tinting if you scrap the other?
I'd still like to talk about tinting. For me, I think that the muffler stamps, we can wait for the noise study. It's gonna be such an awesome study that I think we're gonna get a lot of education from that and we'll learn. Maybe some language that we could do that just directs the agent, the department on the rotors, how to deal with that. I'd like to still talk about it. Is there an opportunity with the window tint? And then I think we need to see the blue light language again.
Okay.
Because then I think we'd be done, Chair.
Great. You can have me back for tinting, signal lamps. And then do you want something like a session law that, like, the intent of the General Assembly that there be a.
And could we direct the DMV to issue
This is not session law.
I can
That is
offer
session law,
this.
but that is session, sorry, that is not, yes, that is session law, but that's session law changing the standard and then telling them to update the periodic inspection manual. I don't know enough about rust and rotors and surface rust to be able to say if the language that you have asked for from Pennsylvania is consistent with the periodic inspection manual. Based on things that you've heard from people who do actually understand surface rust, it seems like they're different.
And if you have language, Jeff Davidson, you could provide, like, if you, how you think it should be worded to say.
I would take a little bit of the language that I believe you recommended about this is not merely surface rust. I would put that in there. I would say this is not surface. I'll show the two pictures. This is surface rust. This rubs off. This is what a 1/2 inch cumulative rust is, and I would just emphasize that this is swelling, delaminated, and pitted.
Right.
You should not be able to remove it with use.
Right.
And
That's the critical.
I can make it that simple, like one pager with a couple of pictures and send out the clarification.
And as long as that is consistent with the periodic inspection manual, I don't think you, the General Assembly, needs to do anything. It doesn't mean that you don't want to do.
But we might want to put it in there.
Why?
So we can tell our constituents we did something about rotor rust.
Well, we did.
Well,
We did.
send out a clarification that.
And it's just clear that we're clarifying. We're clarifying the clarification.
We're clarifying what is safety versus not.
And what the definition is, so they might not have looked at the bottom of the.
People get upset over this, and they're just like, I just spent $1,000 on this.
Well, let me tell you, what used to be really bad was just the surface rust on your new vehicle.
So it was definitely
Had
better than
nothing
it
to
used
do
to
with safety.
Yeah, like that F-150 is brand new that I showed you pictures of, and it turns orange pretty quick. So
Yeah.
that was just over the weekend. There's also
Well,
a lot of people using it.
That'll learn you to get sick.
So I need to know if I should be writing something.
Your rotor got rusted.
I think we should. I don't know what the rest
What do you think?
that we do want something in the bill about.
That wouldn't affect the periodic inspection manual.
Not that it would, that they would just clarify the definition of rust.
If you
clarify.
feel better, but I think that's gratuitous language.
I think it is too.
Support it.
Hmm?
I'd support it. Just because of the passion that I've gotten in my inbox. Maybe I should send you these emails.
Well, apparently I'm missing all the passion in a whole lot of ways.
I mean, because it's just good if it's just clarifying that the DMV is supported, is maybe gonna do it anyway. But, you know, if he retires before it gets done, then the next person's like, oh, I don't have to do this.
Envisioning how I would write it, I would say, like, it is the intent of the General Assembly that the Department of Motor Vehicles issue a clarification or advisory bulletin that disseminates information to, you know, you can put in a X number of thousands of inspection mechanics that clarifies that rust is, include the definition, and you could say, and the advisory bulletin show.
What it is or is not a
include
safety.
pictures that sufficiently or adequately.
We don't even have to include that, like, just that they issue something to clarify what the definition of rust is, and that surface rust is not a fail, even if it's a half inch or whatever it is.
Provided that it's not pitting and getting it all.
Right, pitting, laminating.
So why don't I, go and write that, and I will send it to the DMV, and then you can look at it, and you can decide if you want to include it, knowing what it actually might say, as opposed to just the.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. That's it.
Oh, we have a hand.
Sure, yes.
Yeah, how about this? If you want to address the constituents and you want to address something, why don't you just ask us for recommendation by, I'll put together a committee, we'll give you a written recommendation on whatever categories you want, rust, and whatever, what the language would be, and we present it to you next session, and if you agree to it, we start the APA.
Well, it sounds like we've kind of got it resolved, so.
No, okay.
Yeah.
Unless we'll still have to talk about the window tint.
Yeah, the window tint, and the window tint language is like a deviation from what is current law. It's saying, you know, allowing for tint in places that you might not otherwise like be allowed to have tint now.
Right.
What you just described seems to sort of make sense. It just gives a longer runway to queue up from perspective on all three of these issues for a possible process after certain retirements occur and otherwise. Right?
I'll have it all done before I leave.
Okay, that's it. Thank